This is a Chapter 2 PowerPoint video, Paradigms, Theory, and Research. So we're going to talk a little bit of some social science paradigms. The first is macro theory. So theories are aimed at understanding the big picture of a social problem. So this could be institutions, whole societies, and the interactions among these societies. So we're looking at really things on a very large scale. So, for example, maybe class struggles between, the haves and have-nots, international relations, and the interrelations between social institutions. So, an example of macro-level social research is, for example, homicide rates in different countries. So if we want to figure out why, for example, America has such a high homicide rate compared to similarly developed countries, we would look at sort of these macro-level theories. So we're not necessarily looking at the individuals that live in America and these other countries. We're looking at, the maybe cultural and societal differences in these countries and how this might influence the homicide rate. Microtheory. So I would say most of our social research, especially that in criminology, uses the microtheory. So these theories are aimed at understanding social life on the intimate level of interactions, individuals and their interactions. So we're looking at individual differences here. So maybe something within the individual themselves. Most psychology research looks at this. They look at particular people, maybe the interactions that people have with a dating partner, a family member, etc. We're looking at something on a very small scale. So examples of these: dating behavior, jury deliberations, and student-faculty interactions. So an example of micro-level social research would be, how does parental attachment protect against juvenile delinquency? So we're looking at the relationship between adolescents and their parents to try to understand juvenile delinquency. And somewhere in the middle is mesotheory. So this references an intermediate level between macro and micro. So we're not looking at things on a very large scale, like countries, societies, etc. We're not necessarily looking at the individuals, but rather very small groups. So maybe organizations, smaller communities, and social categories. So an example, again in criminology, of a meso-level social research question would be maybe looking at juvenile gangs. So looking at sort of the interactions of gang members and looking at how these gangs function. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the traditional model of science. Again, this is just to prepare you for the project that you're going to be doing throughout the semester. So first off, theory, we talked a little bit about theory and its importance in Chapter 1. Operationalization, something that's very important to understand, specifically if you're going to be doing quantitative research. So this is basically saying how we're measuring a variable. So we're developing operational definitions, sort of seeing how we're going to measure something and what a variable exactly means. So an operational definition, again, is the concrete and specific definition of something in terms of the operations by which observations are to be categorized. And an observation, specifying the exact operations involved in measuring a variable. So one thing to point out is that there are a lot of different operationalizations for some variables that we use quite often in social science. For example, again, I'm going to use crime. I'm a criminologist. What exactly do we mean by crime? Is this only looking at violent crime? Are we looking at substance use as well? Are we looking at property crime? And how are we measuring this? So a lot of criminology research uses self-report studies, meaning that we're asking people if they have committed this crime before. But we can also use official statistics. So maybe our operationalization of crime is going to be looking at FBI statistics for property crime and violent crime. Okay, so the theory and research cycle can be compared to a relay race, although all participants do not necessarily start or stop at the same point. But they do all share a common goal: to examine all levels of social life. So again, we talked a little bit about this in the first chapter, and we're going to go on into a little more detail now, that we don't always have to start with a theory. Sometimes we start with our observations, but our main goal is the same, to answer our research questions. So both the inductive and deductive method are legitimate and valuable approaches to understanding. So again, your research question and your methodology is going to determine whether you're going to use a deductive or inductive method. Again, for the purposes of your project, you can use either. Generally, I usually use a deductive method, but you're welcome to use an inductive method, and this is particularly the case if you're going to be doing qualitative research. So again, deduction begins with an unexpected pattern that is tested against observations, whereas induction begins with observations and seeks to find a pattern. Okay, deductive theory. Again, logical model in which specific expectations of hypotheses are developed on the basis of general principles. So here you are starting with your theory. You're starting with your theory, which is then going to be used to develop your hypothesis. And then you're going to do your research, look at your observations, and then say whether your theory held up or not. So the deductive model begins with a sometimes vague or general question, which is subjected to the process of specification, resulting in hypotheses that can be tested through empirical observation. So again, what causes why? So for example, maybe I'm going to, look at my theory of social bonds and say that those kids that are more strongly bonded to their parents will be less likely to commit acts of delinquency. So here, maybe I'm going to collect my own data. Maybe I'm going to download a data set, which is perfectly fine to use secondary data. I'm going to do my analyses and then come to the conclusion. Does my hypothesis hold up? Am I going to reject or fail to reject my hypotheses? Does the theory seem to fit? So again, deductive theory construction, first off, specify the topic. What are you looking at? Specify the range of phenomena your theory addresses. Identify and specify your major concepts and variables. So here you're going to be operationalizing your variables. Find out what is known about the relationships among those variables. So do a little research and look at what's been done on the topic so far. Reason logically from those propositions to the specific topic you're examining. And here you will sort of come to the conclusion of whether or not your theory held up. So inductive theory. So again, this is where you're starting at observation. So you're going in with a really open mind. You don't have an idea what you're going to find. You don't have an idea about what is what, basically. This is generally used when it's exploratory in nature, meaning that you really don't know anything about the topic. Maybe there hasn't been anything done on it before. So here you're making your observations, you're collecting your data, you're analyzing your data, making generalizations from those observations, and then developing your theory. So inductive theory construction, again, is usually used with qualitative methods. So you're observing aspects of social life and seeking to discover patterns that may point to relatively universal principles. Grounded theory is something that you might use as well, and this is building your theory and kind of going back, making more observations until you have sort of finished collecting your data. So again, observing comes first, developing a pattern. Maybe as you're developing a pattern, you're thinking, okay, I want to go back and collect some more data. So it's not necessarily, that you collect all your data first and then look at patterns. You're sort of going in grounded theory back and forth and recollecting more data depending on what you're finding here. Again, this is often used in field research or qualitative research. Okay, so one thing that you're going to have to start thinking about is your research question for your final project. So your research question is basically the broad question of what your study aims to answer. So maybe you want to find out, again, why, let's say why the crime rate rose in Lubbock in the past year. And I don't necessarily know that that's true, but maybe that's a research question that you're going to choose. Some studies will have more than one question. Generally, when we're, maybe your thesis or dissertation, or maybe if you're doing a project for an academic journal, you're probably going to have more than one research question, maybe, 2, 3, 4, 5 related questions. For the purposes of your project, I want you to stick with one research question, just because it'll get a little bit too confusing if you use more than one. So for purposes of this class, only stick to one research question, but for your future thesis, maybe dissertation, an academic journal, you might have more than one research question. So quantitative research questions address maybe comparisons. Again, why does Lubbock have more crime than Amarillo? I don't necessarily know if that's the case or not, but that is a good research question for a quantitative project. Maybe a relationship, maybe an association between something. Whereas a qualitative research question aims to explain, explore, or discover. So you want to, start broad and get a little bit more narrow if you're when you're doing your literature review and reviewing prior studies. So you want to start with maybe your topic. Maybe your topic is going to be juvenile delinquency, something super, super broad. As you're looking at prior studies, you're going to gain a little bit of working knowledge of the topic. It's going to narrow down a little more, and then you're going to come to your research question. So maybe from your topic of juvenile delinquency, your research question will be, why are kids that are not supervised by their parents during the summer months more likely to engage in delinquency? Okay, just a couple research questions that people might want to use for their projects. Why do Texas Tech students support student loan forgiveness? Was there more crime in Lubbock in 2022 than 2021? Is probation more effective at preventing recidivism or reoffending than incarceration? What difficulties did parents face during the COVID lockdown? And is there a relationship between age and religiosity? Okay, so hypotheses. This is, you're going to have hypotheses when you use the deductive method. You're not going to have them when you have an inductive method. You don't have to have them for your project. Again, it depends on what sort of method you're using. If you are using a deductive method, you are going to want to have a hypothesis, which is a prediction or expected relationship between two or more variables. So, for example, maybe my hypothesis, which is based on previous research, will be that people in their 20s are more likely to support student loan forgiveness than people in their 60s. Your hypothesis must be testable, meaning that you have to be able to test it to, either reject or fail to reject your hypothesis. And then your null hypothesis. So this is always the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Alternative to your hypothesis. So your hypothesis is that there's a relationship between two variables. In this case, it would be age and student loan forgiveness. And your null hypothesis would be that there is no relationship between those two variables. Okay. One thing, if you are doing your project using the deductive method and are going to be including a hypothesis, you want to state whether there's going to be a positive relationship, a negative relationship, or no relationship. Again, even if you aren't going to be using the deductive method, these questions are definitely going to be on an exam. So a positive relationship would be when one variable increases, so does the other. So for example, the more hours somebody studies for an exam, the higher grade they will get. That just makes sense, right? You're not going to say the more someone studies for exam, the lower grade that they would get, because that really goes against what's been found in the past. A negative relationship is when one variable increases, the other decreases. So here we have college education and unemployment rate. So again, in places where there's a greater percentage of college educated, the employment rate is lower. Another one, those with higher incomes will be less likely to be arrested for a crime. Finally, there might be no relationship. Usually this is a null hypothesis. Usually you're going to want your hypothesis to state either, a positive or negative relationship rather than no relationship. So maybe your hypothesis is that there's, again, a positive relationship between studying and grade, and your null hypothesis would be that there's no relationship between studying and grade.